Hello, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you all back to our first ever Ashford Student Conference. We had some really fantastic presentations this morning, and this afternoon we have even more fantastic students presenting. Our first presentation is going to be by Kelcey Sihanourath. Now, I don't know if I said that right, Kelcey. Was it close?
As close as I can get it.
Okay. Kelcey is pursuing her BA in psychology, and she expects to graduate in 2020. And once she completes her BA, she wants to continue her education to become a psychologist, specializing in military family care. As a mother of three and a military spouse, she has a unique perspective and understanding of military life. She enjoys traveling, and her favorite place to travel is South Korea, and she hopes one day to go back and learn more. She is actually part of the Ashford Honors College, the Golden Key Honor Society, and Alpha Sigma Lambda. So now I want to turn this over to Kelcey, and she's going to talk about Westernization and the End of Interdependence.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kelcey Sihanourath, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Now, when we think about the theme globalization, there are a lot of positives that come with this, such as the spread of information. Today, however, I want to discuss one of the drawbacks of globalization by specifically looking at Westernization and the effect that it has on different cultures. Let us first start by looking at what a culture is. Now, Jennifer Feenstra, an expert in the field of social psychology, defines culture as shared attitudes, beliefs, norms, and expected behaviors. The purpose of a culture is to maintain order within the group of people. For example, a thumbs up in our American culture will indicate a good job. This same gesture in other cultures, such as Australia or the Middle East, is seen as an insult. By having our culture dictate a behavioral norm associated with an action, we're able to understand what other members are trying to convey. Imagine if half of us saw a thumbs up as an insult and the other half did not. There'd be a lot of confusion and hostility towards one another. Now, as a culture defines how a group acts, we can divide culture into two major groups based on how we view ourselves and our relationships with others within the group. The first theme is an independent culture. An independent culture will have the members defining themselves, not based on relationship with others, but as separate parts of a group. I like to think of this kind of like pages in a book. Each page has different words in different orders, and together they make a book. You can take a page out, and there may be a little bit of confusion, but the book could still generally be understood. Places with an independent culture are going to be United States, Canada, Western European countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, as well as parts of Australia. We can examine the individual within a culture by looking at three themes of self. These include self-esteem, self-expression, and self-concept. For independent cultures, each of these three themes will be focused on the self. So when we examine self-esteem, a member of an independent culture will focus on enhancing their personal self-esteem. You'll be likely to hear, "I'm so pretty," or "I have big muscles." Also, when receiving a compliment, it's appropriate to say thank you within this culture, as a person can agree that they are beautiful. Next, we can look at the individual's self-expression through his or her emotions. Typically, independent cultures will have ego-driven emotions such as pride or aggression. Lastly, self-concept is how an individual will define him or herself within a role. These include mother, worker, creative, or clumsy. With independent cultures, self-concept is generally carried through these roles and is not dependent upon others. This is where we'll hear the phrase working mom come into play. Also, if she describes herself as creative, this self-concept will be integrated throughout her various roles of mother, worker, friend, or student. Self-concept will not be based upon the specific role, but instead is a combination of them. The other way that we can generalize a culture is interdependence. With an interdependent culture, the individual will be defined by his or her relationship with others. This culture can be thought of kind of like a human body. If a person is missing or has a damaged liver, although they can still live for some time, there's serious interventions needed to be able to function, and eventually there will need to be a replacement. We can generally see interdependent cultures within Asian countries, Central South America, and Middle Eastern countries such as Egypt. Looking at the three themes of self, each of these will be focused on others. Self-esteem will be built up through compliments from others and by complimenting others. You'll be more likely to hear a conversation like, "You're so pretty." "No, you're so pretty." When given a compliment, it is expected to return the compliment or it is seen as arrogance. For interdependent cultures, self-expression will also be based on the relationship with others. We can see this in emotions such as shame or sympathy. There's also a strong belief in face, or how others view the individual. Self-concept for interdependent cultures is role-specific. When asked how one would define him or herself, an interdependent individual would most likely say when or where. For example, the way a person acts at home is less likely to carry over into work. It's important to mention that with a larger culture, there are subcultures. We can see this in the United States by examining Native American cultures. The smaller interdependent culture from Native Americans is within the larger independent culture of the United States. We are not likely to see an independent culture within a larger interdependent culture. Thinking of the human body analogy, if the body would fail if the heart decided to go be independent and not connect to anything else. A book, however, could still be a book, even if several chapters decided to discuss the same topic. Now that we understand the two types of culture, let's examine the idea of Westernization. Westernization is when an independent culture influences the economics, policies, or cultures of another place. For example, Saudi Arabia was influenced by the United States to allow women to drive. This Westernized norm influeed the traditionally interdependent conservative country. David Ohana, an expert in the modern history of Europe, stated that there is a lure to Westernization. With Westernization, there's an increase in living standards, increase in technology, industrial growth, and, as seen in Saudi Arabia, more rights for individuals. We can see evidence of Westernization all over the world by simply looking at McDonald's. Another example is in South Korea with their infrastructure of major highways. Road signs are near exact copies of what you would see in the United States, which played a role in the Westernization of South Korea. It's important to understand that the ideals of Westernization will always come from independent cultures. Well, throughout this presentation, I'll be showing how, as a traditionally interdependent nation becomes Westernized, the focus will shift from others to self. Using longitudinal studies from the past 45 years, we'll show the impact of Westernization. And by specifically examining eating behaviors, crime rates, family dynamics, and socioeconomic circumstances, we can see how the three themes of self are shifting from other to self. First, we can examine self-esteem. To illustrate a typical self-esteem enhancement for interdependence, Marcus and Kitayama describe a Japanese supermarket as starting each day by holding hands and telling each other that he or she is beautiful. This is a direct example of how interdependent cultures build each other's self-esteem. They also went on to describe how a company in an independent culture encourages their employees to look in the mirror and say, "I am beautiful," 100 times before coming to work in order to enhance their personal self-esteem. One objective way to measure self-esteem is to look at disordered eating habits. These include diets that are not done for health-related reasons and eating disorders. Researchers Button, Lone, Davis, and Sunugabark found that low self-esteem is directly correlated to developing an eating disorder. Now recall that interdependent cultures will define self-esteem based on others. This is why researchers believe there's lower eating disorder rates in countries with interdependence, such as Malaysia or Egypt. A study done by Gunwardine, Huan, and Zhang examined Australian women, Chinese immigrants to Australia, and Chinese women. They found that Australian women had the highest rate of dieting, while Chinese women had the lowest rate. Interestingly, they also found that the Chinese immigrants to Australia were developing dieting habits at a higher rate than those in China. They believe that this provides evidence that Westernization is a predictor of dieting. Further evidence can be seen by a study done by Pike and Boroboy. They found eating disorders in Japan have increased since World War II. For a brief history lesson, after World War II, the United States occupied and brought Westernization into Japan. As we see, there's evidence that Westernization from independent cultures is causing shift in the traditionally interdependent views of self-esteem. The next theme of self is self-expression. We can objectively measure self-expression through overt, intentional emotions such as aggression. But before we do that, let's first discuss aggression. Aggression, according to Feenstra, is an innate behavior that is influenced by the social environment. It peaks at toddlerhood and decreases as the behavior is taught to be socially unacceptable. It is important to note that aggression and violence are not the same thing, although they are often used interchangeably. Aggression can be defined in two categories. The first is instrumental aggression. This is goal-directed behaviors where harm to another is not the goal, but is just a result of the action. This is kind of also known as assertiveness. The next category of aggression is reactive. This is spontaneous action with the goal to do harm and is a result of anger. When an individual has reactive aggression, we typically say that he or she is hot-headed. Anger results in decreased cognitive ability, so usually after reactive aggression, there is regret. Violence, although very close to aggression, is a planned action with the intent to permanently harm or kill, and is typically not an immediate result of anger. When examining the differences between interdependent and independent cultures, it is important to note that both cultures will restrain from violence. However, an independent culture will use aggression as self-expression to gain influence, power, or to give insights into feelings. Examples of aggressive emotions can be seen in assertion, frustration, and impulsivity. We can objectively measure these negative overt emotions by examining bullying rates, drug usage, or the rates of violent crimes such as rape, assault, or robbery. To illustrate the differences in culture, a child hits another child for going down the slide. An independent mother would say that we do not hit. That's not nice. When angry, we can stomp. The interdependent mother would say we do not hit because hitting makes the other child cry. We be nice to others and we do not want them to think that we are bad. This is part of that face. Although both are taught not to hit, there's a difference in the ultimate reason for not hitting. Interdependent cultures focus on new ways to express aggression, while interdependent cultures will focus on the other's feelings and avoid aggressive emotions. We can examine bullying and instrumental aggression. Bullying is due to a lack of connections. So if an interdependent culture has bullying, there's evidence of lack of connections. Researchers Sun and Sheik did a study in Hong Kong, a westernized unautonomous territory of China, during the 2006-2007 school year. They found that there has been a rising trend of school violence as well as psychotropic drug use and other undesirable negative behaviors such as stealing, truancy, fighting, and sexual behaviors. This shows that negative emotions are not being suppressed anymore, and instead there is an increase in instrumental aggression. Further evidence from Hong Kong found that as the youth are being brought up in this hybrid, westernized, interdependent culture, there's a difference in the crime rates between adults and juveniles. Researchers Wong found that in 2001, violent crimes accounted for 26.7% of all juvenile crimes, while adults were only at 19.9%. This provides evidence that younger generations are beginning to express emotions based on self-satisfaction instead of the traditional other-centric emotions. Wong even stated that, quote, in the present-day capitalistic societal background of Hong Kong, many people in all social strata are putting too much effort into the income-generating and hedonistic activities. This includes teenagers who are becoming more self-centered, over-affectionate, or emotional and do not know how to control these emotions and anger. Aggressive behavior is seen as getting worse by teachers and parents, and they often loosen the family bonds and school bonds. Now that we've examined changes in self-expression and self-esteem, we can examine the last theme of self, which is self-concept. Recall that self-concept is based on how an individual defines him or herself within a role. For interdependent individuals, self-concept will vary based on the role that the individual is in, while independent individuals will have a generally constant self-concept. Because self-concept is difficult to measure objectively, we can look at the relationships to see changes in self-concept. For interdependent individuals, their self-concept is determined by the role that he or she plays within a relationship. To illustrate, wife is the role that will define the self-concept within the relationship of marriage. The wife may define herself as loyal because she does not cheat on her husband. Feenstra states that one can measure the dependency and satisfaction within a relationship by looking at the reward and cost, or interdependence theory. For interdependent cultures, we can expect that there will be relationship maintenance because the individual would lose that self-concept if they were to end the relationship. In our previous example, the woman would not be able to say that she is loyal if there's no longer a husband to whom she is loyal. The cost of losing the self-concept would typically not outweigh the reward of happiness. Some specific relationships that we can objectively measure for dissolvement are going to be marriage, working relationships, and the importance of elders. The first relationship we can examine is marriage, and divorce rates would provide the measure of relationship maintenance. A survey conducted by Dion and Dion found that to a traditionally interdependent country, divorce is considered the greatest social evil. To illustrate, Malaysia has a crude divorce rate of 1.6, Egypt is at 1.9. Both of these countries are independent cultures. For America, an independent country, the crude divorce rate is at 3.2. Researchers Xi and Dinging found that Shanghai, a westernized territory of China, had a 127.5% increase in divorce rates from 1980 to 1990. Note that in 1950, the new Chinese marriage law allowed women to legally divorce, so this increase is not due to new laws. Instead, in the late 1970s, there was a vast increase in foreign investments, influences, and ideas, which does correlate to this as there's higher economic growth following decades. Further, Demont noted that divorce is more common in urbanized areas, which is where we find more Western influence. The increase in divorce shows that as the individual begins to define self not by the role within marriage, but they begin to see themselves as separate entities deserving of happiness, which is a very strong independent view. Next, we can examine another concept of self, economic class. According to Grosson and Barnum, interdependent cultures will typically thrive in areas of socio-economic classes that are lower. Think of a small village and how we must work together to care for the crops and the children. Without one another, we wouldn't really be able to maintain the village. With this village, each member is only able to produce a certain amount of a resource. With the limited resources, interdependence is going to be crucial in avoiding a commons dilemma, which is when a resource is unable to provide for the group due to individuals acting in self-interest ways. With no self-interest and a constant amount of resource, an individual is unable to change their socioeconomic class within the community. By being interdependent, an individual is defined by the social status that he or she is born into. With the introduction of Westernization, however, there's economic growth and increased technology, which will lead to more available resources. We can compare Malaysia and Japan. Malaysia has had insignificant economic growth, which researchers and more state that this is a direct result of the country's low openness. On the other hand, Japan has had astonishing economic growth post-World War II. Okawa and Ravosky state that this is due to their acceptance of Westernized influence and technology. With Westernization and the increase of technology, individuals are able to produce more resources, and with the available resources increased, there is a decrease in the chance of commons dilemma occurring. This allows for individuals to act on their self-interest and take more of the resource. With that greater amount of resource that an individual has, they can change their role within the community. Thus, we see the development of a middle class. It is important to note that the middle class are made from individuals who acted on self-interest to change their status. Their focus shifted from the community to the self. They're no longer dependent upon the traditional role within the community, but as separate members capable of defining him or herself. This is how an independent culture will define self-concept. If you think about the American dream and how with hard work you can be anything you want to be. The next evidence of shifting self-concept can be seen by examining working mothers. Traditionally, interdependent cultures tend to have similar family dynamics. This belief is that females are to become wives and then mothers, and males will work to provide for the family. Elders are respected as leaders, and they are cared for by their children. In Japan, there's a term called shufu, which means professional housewife. When a woman has a child, it is expected for her to remain home and define herself as shufu. As Japan shifts from the traditionally interdependent views, however, we see women defining themselves not as shufu, but as working mothers. They're continuing to work, and they're this is a rising trend. A study done by researchers Yoshiro and Mashiro examined the rates of Japanese women workers and American workers. They found that with no children, Japanese women were employed at 82% and Americans were employed at 77%. With children under 1, Japan was at 28 and USA was at 54. With children over 5, Japan was at 73 and the US was at 71. When compared no children to children over 5, we see that Japan experienced only an 8.7% decrease, while American women experienced a 6.7% decrease. Japanese women are returning to work with nearly comparable rates to the United States. Japanese women are no longer needed to define their self-concept as shufu. Now they are able to say that they are both a working mother. This is a significant change in how they define themselves. Lastly, we can examine the relationship between elders and their children. Greenfield and Cocking state that interdependent cultures call for obedience. Unlike independent cultures, they'll call for innovation. A major factor for obedience is respect for elders and traditions. For interdependent cultures, the youth do not question elders, as this is seen as disrespectful. However, this does lead to a lack of critical thinking. As traditions become an integral part of this type of culture, they therefore cannot be challenged. In a traditional interdependent culture such as Japan, the elders will live with their children in a hierarchical family status with grandparents on top. Dr. Chua stated that grandparents help reinforce and assure transmission of the culture and the traditions. When examining the family dynamics of Japan, there's evidence of a hierarchy shift within the family. Since the 1970s, there's been a decrease in elders living with children from 73.9 to 61.6 in 1985. This trend, according to Hiroshima findings, has been a gradual decrease that's continuing to fall. Further, in 2017, the Japan Times stated that there were over 5,000 homeless with an average age of 61.5 years old. And in China, a parent can sue their child for not visiting. Also, the child is required to pay a monthly allowance to the parents to support them, even if the child forgoes his or her inheritance rights. The once obedient children who did not question their parents are challenging the idea of the traditional family hierarchy and their role within it. Individuals are not defining their self-concept as obedient children. Instead, they are shunning the idea of creating their own family hierarchy. We can see this as more and more elders are not living with their children. And as the youth become more independent, the interdependent elders are left without a role to fulfill. And with no means of support, more and more elders are forced into homelessness. As we've seen, traditionally interdependent cultures, when they become westernized, there's a shift from interdependence to independence as evident in the 3 themes of self-esteem, self-expression, and self-concept. The research has shown that there's changes in the way the interdependent culture defines self due to the influences from Western cultures. This is seen in the eating disorders, crime rates in the younger generations, the changes in the family dynamics, such as the divorce, women working outside the home, and not caring for elders. I think that further longitudinal studies should be done in the hybrid cultures to see if there's a continued shift towards becoming independent. Also, to ensure that there's not another cultural phenomenon at work, more researchers should go to non-influenced countries such as Laos or Micronesia. I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity to present my ideas on globalization. And if there are no further questions, this concludes my presentation, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Thanks, Kelcey. Were there any questions? Anybody have any questions for Kelcey? I just wanted to comment on the fact that it is very shocking to people in traditional cultures when they look at the United States and the way that our elders are treated. And it's seems to be pretty well supported with the data that you just presented. You know, a lot of my research has been in countries, and a lot of places that I've visited have been in countries where elders do generally live with their children and are taken care of by their children. So it's very interesting. Dana said that, I don't know if you've seen her comment, the comment from Dana Dillard. What a great presentation. This also has important implications for elder health, such as depression and Alzheimer's.